Trust is bidirectional. That means that if I trust you, you'll trust me, you're more likely to trust me. And as you trust me, I'm more likely to trust you. And it can spiral upward. It can build to deeper and deeper, higher and higher levels of trust. But the same goes with the negative feeling. If you distrust me, I'm likely to distrust you. And that can spiral downward to deep levels of distrust. Trust is critical, but it needs constant nurturing. It needs constant cultivation. It needs attention. We need to be paying attention to our thoughts and our actions because they influence how we behave and how we trust each other. This bidirectional system of trust relates to classroom outcomes. It relates to how we teach. It relates to how students learn. It relates to how we learn with our students and from our students. On the first day, the first week of school, you are the ambassador for trust. You are the ones that will design and cultivate a space that has high levels of trust or low levels of trust. You have power and authority over your students. That makes the responsibility on you for trusting them first. And think about the fact that how you see your students, the filter that you use to add meaning to their behavior, leads to how you treat your students. Your actions follow the way you see your students. So if you're seeing your students generally as unkind, mischievous, and so on, you're seeing them as untrustworthy. They're not worthy of your trust. Are you with me? If you're seeing your students as kind, honest, open, then you're seeing them as trustworthy or worthy of your trust. Now remember, trust begins with you. So how you see your students influences how you treat them. And if you treat them as if they are untrustworthy, they will act as they are untrustworthy. Students will decide if you are trustworthy based on your actions, how you treat them. So if you're seeing them as untrustworthy, you're going to treat them as though they are untrustworthy, and they are going to perceive you as if you are untrustworthy. And what's that going to do? That's not going to spiral in a good direction. Students are going to test you in the first weeks of school. The way you respond to their behavior is going to determine whether or not they trust you and whether they perceive you as trustworthy. So let me begin with an example. This was in one of my first weeks of school as a teacher ever. And it was in this inner city school in Norfolk, Virginia. And I had a class where I was taught to teach with activities. And so there was an activity that I had planned and that I wanted students to engage with. And two young men decided that they thought the activity was stupid. It was beneath them. These are young men who I knew because other people had told me had been arrested for stealing cars, had been known or thought, expected to be selling drugs, to be doing all sorts of things that we know is not helpful for their future. And so I had a choice to make, and I'll tell you about the decision that I made later. But you can see that in that situation, they were defying my authority in the classroom, and I could say, you must do the activity or you are going to go to the principal's office. I had a right to do that. Or I could do something different. And the choice was clearly in front of me. And I'll keep you in suspense for a moment. The most inspiring materials that I read in my teacher training program came from Haim Ganat. And this quote in particular is one that has stayed with me throughout my entire teaching career. I have come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. I possess tremendous power to make life miserable or joyous. Do we want compliant, dead-eyed, disengaged learners who are quiet? Or do we want joyous, vibrant, fully engaged, having fun, loving, learning type students? What do we want in our classroom? Because we get to decide. We design it. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis is escalated or de-escalated, and a person is humanized or dehumanized. If we treat people as they are, if we treat them the way they're acting, we make them worse. If we treat people as they ought to be, we help them become what they are capable of becoming. And the world needs our students to become what they're capable of becoming. Trust in the classroom begins with the teacher, and it begins on the first day of class. So think about this for a moment. How deeply do you trust your students? How does your trust in your students show up in your classroom? When your students test you, how do we respond? This is really where emotional intelligence feeds right in to cultivating high-trust classrooms that thrive. Because how we respond when students test us, whether it's a minor expression of testing or a major expression of testing, how we respond is in our control. When our students test us, our response can increase their capacity to change the world, or it can humiliate and belittle, and it can make their dreams smaller, and it can make their belief in themselves smaller. That's a horrible thing to do. The world needs better from us. And so we have this crazy complex model that I'm going to talk through by telling you the rest of the story about my student, who I'm going to use the name Michael, because Michael is a common name in my family. My husband is Michael, my dad is Michael, my brother is Michael, and I have a cousin named Michael. And so I just thought Michael would be the appropriate name for this story. So you know that Michael and his friend are defying me. They're saying in front of the whole class, nope, I'm not going to do it, and you can't make me. And so I had been thinking intentionally. This is my first year of teaching. I was new at this, but I had done a lot of reflection about that Haim Ganat story, or quote, and I thought a lot about my power as a teacher. That had prepared me to think about trust as a bi-directional relationship between me and the students. And how was I going to build trust in that situation and not degrade trust in that situation? And so that's influenced my propensity to trust my students is dependent on a lot of things, as the model expresses. It's dependent on my understanding about the students. It's dependent on my expectations for the students. It's dependent on my faith in humanity. It's dependent on how I see those students. And I grew up in a home where we were taught in our religion that it's really important to see the good in every person, that humanity at its essence is good, and that most people are mostly good most of the time. And that if we see that goodness, we'll experience more of that goodness. And so that was influencing me too, my upbringing, my propensity to see people as good, even when they're misbehaving. And this is all happening very quickly in my mind, but I had also read a book that had informed me. I read it the summer before I started teaching there. Deborah Meyer's book, The Power of Their Ideas. And it was about her experience as a teacher in an inner city school in New York City. and about how they cultivated the conditions for those students to speak their mind, to say when things weren't working for them, to challenge their teachers to be better. And these students succeeded at remarkable levels, way beyond what typical people would think inner city high school students could perform at. And it was a real inspiration to me, and I wanted to be that kind of teacher. I wanted to cultivate those type of conditions in my classroom. And so with that, my response to them was, okay, you don't have to do the activity. That's fine. I have a lot of papers that have to be passed out for the activity. Would you be willing to help me pass those out? Now, of course, they wanted power in the classroom. They wanted to be the center of everyone's attention. So they didn't even think twice. Of course they wanted to help me pass out the papers. So they did. And I think that my response caught them a little bit off guard because I didn't engage a power struggle with them. I empowered them in an appropriate way, or a more appropriate way. And I think they perceived that as somewhat benevolent, as kind, as thoughtful, as surprising. They were surprised by my offer to empower them to help me pass out the papers. And it's interesting that while they were passing out those papers, they saw what the activity was, and they wanted to do it. And they said to me, and I was Ms. Kensler at the time, they said, or Ms. K, they all called me, Ms. K, can we do the activity? And I said, well, sure you can, but those are all groups of 4, and you all are only a group of 2. You're going to have to do twice the work. And they said, okay, we'll do that. All right. So now, instead of having 2 students that were sent to the principal's office, I had 2 students who were willing to do twice the work. It was a real lesson for me early on that we can empower our students, even when they seem to be misbehaving. We have to be creative in how we redirect their energy to be more appropriate. And what happened in that classroom is the other students saw my response to those students as well. And my response was different than they were used to. They were used to being belittled. They were used to being disciplined. And a different response was pulling them closer. And that doesn't mean that the rest of the year was perfect. There were times when they really misbehaved. And there were times when I had to be more firm and stand strong in my authority. But I always tried to do it with a sense of deep love. And I believe that seeing the goodness in the people that we're learning with is about love. And loving them was really important, and they felt that love. And there were times that I made mistakes. There were times when I had to go to them and say, you know what, that was a really bad lesson, and it's no wonder that you misbehaved, because it wasn't fun, it wasn't smart, it wasn't engaging, it was not good. And I was willing to have the humility to go to them and say, I'm sorry about that. I'm going to try better next time. And they were willing to receive that because they understood that that was trustworthy behavior. And so they would forgive me for those mistakes. They would forgive me if I was unkind and got angry and lost control and yelled at them or gave them silent treatment or whatever the strategies might have been. But for the most part, we had really good experiences. And our classroom outcomes were as good in that class as in my high-level gifted class. So I taught the lowest class and I taught the gifted class. And my 2 classes, on average, performed the same. And so, you know, students have a lot of things that influence whether they're inclined to trust teachers. So students come to you not necessarily willing to trust you right off the bat. You have a reputation among your students, right? So what is that reputation? How do your students see you? How do they talk about you to other students? What do they say to them? Because those students will come into your classroom next week with preconceived ideas about how you're going to treat them. And some of them will be feisty and courageous enough to test you. And are you going to reinforce your reputation, or are you interested and wanting to develop a new reputation? Are you willing to take a risk and see what will happen? Those are all big questions to ask and to think about. So when our students perceive us as trustworthy, they're more likely to act in trustworthy ways. And that brings us back up to closes the loop of this crazy model. But basically what I just talked through is that complexity of the bidirectional relationship. That bidirectional relationship of trust is dependent on a lot of factors. And all of those things influence how we behave. And how we behave influences how our students see us. And then they bring that into the mix of their past experience with teachers, their experiences in their family, their experiences in the things that they've learned and maybe read before. And so all of that mixes together in this complex system of trust. Here are some questions for you to consider. How do you see your students and why? Do you expect them to be trustworthy first, or are you willing to be trustworthy first? What powerful strengths do you see in each student? And how do you see them and celebrate them and honor them and empower them in your students? How do your students see you? And how do you want them to see you? What changes might be needed in your behavior, in your approach to working with students, in order for them to see you as more trustworthy? How do you respond when students test you? And what does that testing behavior look like in your classrooms? And why do you respond the way you do? Do you make it about you and your power and your status? Do you avoid being vulnerable with them? Or do you cultivate the condition in which all of our learning can thrive? So those are the questions of reflection that I leave with you. Thank you so much for your attention. And I hope that you are inspired to do everything you can to cultivate the conditions in which learning will thrive in your classrooms.